Hello, welcome back to Property Spy. This is the channel where we appraise properties and we do everything property. We go out there and we look for those nuggets, those bits of information that shall benefit those who are interested in property. Whether you're just starting or you're an experienced investor, there will be some information that you would benefit from today. Now, today we are going to be looking at ground rents. Now, as I've been searching for properties and different things to invest in, I've come across a property here that I'll be going to auction in a few days' time. It's a ground rent opportunity. It's not the building itself, it's a ground rent. It's been known that some people have seen pictures and not really delved into the detail to find out if they're buying the property itself or the ground rent. So in this case, it is the ground rent. Now, what is a ground rent? Now, ground rent is the income a freeholder earns from people who have the long leasehold on the properties that are on top of the land that the freeholder owns. So, for instance, if you're purchasing, this is common when you're purchasing apartments or flats. If you're purchasing a flat, typically there will be two other charges that you have to pay on top of your mortgage. The first is the service charge, and that's the amount of money you pay for the upkeep of the communal spaces of the apartment block. And the second thing is ground rent, and that's essentially paying for the ground upon which the building is sat. Now, how is this a huge investment? Well, as is the case with what we are looking at here, there are 32 leasehold agreements. So 32 different flats, that's the assumption. So 32 different flats, each one pays around £150 per year, which comes to about £4,800 per annum. The guide price on this one is £60,000, which gives us a yield of roughly 8%. But before we delve in, let's go through some of the nuances around ground rent and some of the things you need to look out for. So we'll touch on 7 different points for you to bear in mind, and I might throw in a bonus at the end. So I've explained what a ground rent is. A ground rent can either be commercial or residential, but in this case we are looking at residential properties because the whole block is a residential block. It was built by Barratt in 1993 or 1994, and everyone in there, I suppose, has a lease, and based on that lease, they'll be paying you a certain amount of ground rent. And they've very kindly told us the amount of money they pay for the service charge, and that's £57,000. Now, as far as I know, you're not allowed to make a profit from the service charge. So it's what you're charged as a freeholder, that's exactly what you pass on to the leaseholders. There's also the thing with high-rise buildings that have suffered from being built with a wrong cladding, type of thing that triggered the disaster in South London. Now, if you've got cladding that's flammable, then the freeholder may pass on the cost of replacing that flammable surface onto the leaseholders. So in this case, we don't have that additional complication. It's just a standard brick build. That's what it looks like anyway from here. And it should be a straightforward collect your money every year and go. Now, the opportunities to look out for when purchasing a freehold is sometimes there is opportunity to build for additional development. So if there is land behind the block you're buying, or there is a rooftop opportunity to extend another floor above the top floor, it's called a rooftop development. So that benefit, because you're the freeholder, automatically accrues to you. Sometimes, depending on the lease and the wording of the lease, you may have to negotiate with the people that own the top floor flats to see if they will let you develop the roof. If not, sometimes that's excluded from the lease of the top floor and you own the rights. So all you have to negotiate is how you can get into the roof to do the work, and all that benefit accrues to you. And then the other benefit is lease extensions. So in the mortgage world, if you're purchasing a mortgage, generally speaking, lenders do not like any apartment or any building that has less than 70-year lease remaining. So this is for residential mortgages and for apartments. They consider the risk on a 70-year loan to be too high and wouldn't lend. And In some cases, a valuer might actually recommend that lending should not be extended if there is less than 80 years. So that's something to bear in mind. There is an opportunity there for you as the freeholder, because if the number of years remaining is less than 70 years or less than 80 years even, you can charge a lump sum to have the lease extended. So provided the owner of the apartment qualifies and has the right, they can apply to you as a freeholder to have the lease extended, and you quote them a price. This is obviously negotiable based on what valuers and surveyors would agree, but there is a price. It could be 10,000, it could be 50,000, it could be 100,000, it could be 300,000, depending on the location and the land values in your area. They pay that lump sum and then you extend the lease, and generally the extension will be 90 years. So the opportunity there is the money you can make through the lease extension. Then with service charges, if the leaseholders do not pay their ground rent or their service charge, there is a risk they would have to forfeit the whole apartment. Generally speaking, ground rents tend to be paid. They're usually quite low, £150, some are as low as £10. I've heard of peppercorn rents, that's minuscule, but in this case there is £150. So you generally would not get arrears with ground rent. Where the arrears might come in might be the service charge, because that's a bit more money than the ground rent, but that's a fairly secure amount of money. And some lenders may lend on your ground rent income. Obviously you need to think about the return on your investment and the interest you're paying the lender that's lending on the ground rent income. So there, if there's enough of a margin between what you're getting from your lender and the yield from your ground rent, then it could potentially be a no money down deal or no money left in deal, or quite profitable as you exploit the margins. Now, for every opportunity, there is always going to be a risk. Now, here are some of the main risks, and as we go into the fourth thing I want to mention, there's something called enfranchisement. Enfranchisement essentially gives all of the leaseholders the ability and the right to essentially purchase that freehold from you and own it for themselves. And I believe more than 50% of the leaseholders must agree and come together and pay you what that freehold is worth. And provided they agree and they can get their act together and pay you the money, you have to pass that freehold onto the leaseholders of the building. Typically, with huge ground rents, 36 units, it's very difficult. It can be very difficult to get, well, in this case, almost 20 people to agree that they want to go ahead with the purchase, and then 20 people to stump up the cash and everything. So, what strategy a lot of freeholders go for is they go for buildings with a lot of apartments, and they collect ground rents on that basis, knowing that it's difficult to get too many people to agree. So that there's a bit of security there. But if in this case 20 of these people come together, even 18 or 19 of these people come together and decide that they want to take on the freehold, they can franchise, and it's a legal right. The other risks are, because you're the freeholder, you're essentially responsible for the communal spaces and the building and the land upon which that building sits. One of the risks could be flooding or fire or collapse or damage or whatever. So that is a major risk, but you should have insurance. And if you've got insurance and all these things are covered, then it's not so much a risk. And provided those things are covered and the insurance would pay out, then the leaseholders should continue to pay the ground rent to you as a freeholder, because their asset is protected and they'll get back the building if there's anything to happen. Now, the biggest risk, in my opinion, is political risk. This ground rent has been in the news recently because of some developers who decided to include really should I say, extortionate terms in their ground rent lease documents, especially for houses. Generally in the UK, most houses are automatically considered freehold, but in some cases, some developers decided to sell houses on a leasehold basis. It's very difficult to justify a leasehold house, and politically, the government is looking into ways of changing the law so that it's no longer allowed, or they make it extremely difficult for any freeholder or any developer to sell a leasehold house. And in terms of the leases on flats, there may be a cap on how much you can charge. And then the other issue with some of the leases that were agreed a few years ago was that you had ground rents that were doubling every 5 years or every 10 years. And clearly, if your ground rent doubles every 10 years, then it won't take a long time before you realize that that initial £150 suddenly goes to £50,000 or £20,000, and that becomes a really big problem when you're trying to sell, because the person who's buying from you would look at staying in the property for, let's say, 40 years, and if every 10 years it's doubling, it goes from 150 to 300, from 300 to 600, from 600 it goes to 1,200, and if they're planning to pass that asset on to their children, then it's just a never-ending increase, and it made those properties less attractive and very difficult to sell on after the initial purchase. So that's something that the government is clamping down on, and it sounds reasonable because a lot of the older ground rents tended to be £10 and £150. £150 is fairly common. Those are the main things. And then the final thing with the ground rent is the rights you have as a freeholder. So if you're the freeholder and somebody owns one of your apartments and they decide to just stay out their lease, so they spend a whole 150 years and don't decide to extend, then that property automatically comes back to you as a freeholder, and suddenly you have this expensive asset that you've paid only 60 grand for, and that has happened. It's been known to happen. It's not common, but the issue is that often people purchase flats or apartments and cannot afford to extend the lease or cannot afford to do anything with the lease, and they have no choice but just to pass it on or sell on, especially with apartments with short leases. And there is a business model based on those short lease apartments, and you find short leases in auction, mainly due to the difficulty in financing short leases. But ultimately, there is money to be made there. For you to qualify for the extension, you need to have spent 2 years at least, or have the right to extend passed on to you by someone who has spent 2 years in the property. So those are my 7 points. Now let's look at the valuation on this particular property that will be in auction. So it's guided at £60,000. The income that's guaranteed to you is it's allocated to you. I wouldn't say guaranteed, but allocated to you is £4,800. That's an 8% return on your money, which isn't bad when compared to other investments. Savings rates and things like that, or government bonds and stuff. 8% is pretty good. The only thing is you are tying down £60,000. If you've got £60,000 just sat in the bank doing nothing, then this is something worth considering. I imagine that in the auction this will probably go for a bit higher. There are companies that specialize in investing in ground rents. They will be bidding for this opportunity. I think it's priced and guided at a fairly good price. So that's mainly it for this one. There are so many different strategies you can employ as a property investor. This is one of many. It's something that you want to look into. If you need any help with appraising any properties going to auction or determining what you should be paying, then contact valat.io. We're here to help. We help people with their investments. We help people find deals and find opportunities. So do get in touch, valup.io. As always, this is not investment advice. This is not financial advice. This is just a video I've done for entertainment purposes. So thank you very much for listening, and happy investing.